Kill me.
Welcome to Scapegoat Media. Today we're going to talk about a number of subjects, including the wealth tax, pharmacare, the Montreal 2020 budget, and more. We are joined today by Caitlin, the Flutey Feminist.
Hi.
You can catch her on Facebook and Instagram at the Flutey Feminist, on Twitter at Flutey Feminist, and her WordPress blog, the Flutey Feminist. Links to every plug will be in the description below. We are also joined by Santiago in Toronto.
Hey.
You can catch him on Twitter at Hello Quintero, and also Toronto DSC. He is a fellow member of the Democratic Socialists of Canada. He runs the Toronto chapter, and joined by my co-host Tyler.
Howdy.
You can catch him at AddieJib on Twitter, and you can
catch me if you can.
And you can follow Scapegoat Media on Facebook, YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter at media_scapegoat, and on Instagram at scapegoat.media. So we're going to have a relatively structured but also free-form discussion where each one of us is going to take the lead on various discussions, and then we will open the floor to general back and forth. So Caitlin, why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So I wanted to talk about Montreal's budget for the next year for 2021, and particularly how it applies to or pertains to the police budget. So I think it was earlier this week that the budget was announced for next year, and the Montreal is describing it as a balanced budget totaling $6.17 billion, which is a lot of money. And so what I found interesting is the division of the budget. So what they're actually spending money on, which, to be honest, is not something that I had ever taken a look at before, despite living in Montreal my whole life. But I had seen news articles saying that the government was going to increase police spending. So I looked up the budget, and so they're spending the most on public safety, which is basically just policing, as well as debt servicing, which sounds not real, but anyways. And then they're spending the least on social housing, which is one of the sectors they're spending the least on, and the other one is waste collection and disposal and the environment. So their priorities are interesting to note. So in terms of the police budget itself, the Montreal City will be increasing their budget by $15 million, which is, again, a lot of money. And it goes back into the, it's part of the public safety slice, which is 17.6% of the total budget for next year. And so what that means for the police operating budget is that it's going to be $679 million in 2021, which I just keep saying is just a lot of money. I'm someone who wants to defund, of course, the police, and believes in that, and believes in abolishing the police system as well. So this was really disheartening. At the unveiling of the budget, there were protesters demanding to defund the police and chanting the names of the men who have been murdered by police officers. And I wanted to note that just as recently as October 29th, there was a Black man named Sheffield Matthews who was shot and killed by police in NDG, which is the area that I live in Montreal. So policing and racism in Montreal is still a huge crisis, really. So the fact that Montreal's budget is increasing in the police sector is really, really scary. I also wanted to just mention some points made by the city of Montreal. surrounding the budget. So they have stated that they're continuing their efforts to meet the needs of the most vulnerable populations. And they keep kind of stating that they're stating that they understand that there's a systemic nature of racism and discrimination in Montreal. And they have actually created a new office, so the Office of the Commissioner for the Fight Against Racism and Systemic Discrimination. They're going to be allocating $0.5 million to this office. But again, $15 million, well, an increase of $15 million to the police budget, totaling $679 million next year. So the difference is staggering. They have also stated that they want to better prevent racial and social profiling. So they're going to adopt an action plan designed in collaboration with the SPVM, which is the Montreal Police. So this is all basically very frightening and disheartening information, mostly because it's just very hypocritical. I think, earlier this year when the Black Lives Matter protests kind of resurged, and, everyone, most people were, and most governments were talking about systemic racism and all of that sort of thing. It's just, the governments keep telling us that they understand that racism exists. They understand that systemic racism is alive and well, but then they go and increase the police budget, and they try to have action plans in partnership with the SPVM. And so it just is not making sense. I feel like they're gaslighting us, just trying to keep telling us like, yeah, no, we care. And they don't actually care. So I think it's a really huge mistake. I think it's going to actively harm the lives of marginalized Montrealers, notably Black and Indigenous people, as their communities are over-policed and they face murder at the hands of police officers in Montreal. So I think it also just really shows Montrealers what the government's priorities are, which are not definitely not in line with anything they say about wanting to prevent systemic racism. So I think we have to divest resources away from policing institutions and towards mental health resources, housing. As I had mentioned, one of the sectors they're spending the least on is social housing and other. I'm not sure what the other is, but as well as the environment, which is also worrying. So yeah, I think their priorities in this situation are really upside down, and it's a really harmful move on the city's part.
Yeah, I think you said all that perfectly. I think gaslighting is the perfect word here, because I just looking at the proportion of, the percentage of everything that is being funded here, what 0.5, like $500,000 going to this new office that supposedly is supposed to provide oversight to racism and discrimination within the SPVM. The rest of that $678.5 million is going to go to enforcing that discrimination.
Yep.
It's really infuriating on multiple levels. I mean, for one, like, this is, Valérie Plante and Plante Montreal are a municipal spin-off of Québec Solidaire, which is the only socialist party in the legislature in Quebec. They really campaigned on a progressive platform, particularly on social housing and the environment. Those were at the very top of Valérie Plante's list during the 2018 campaign.
Right. At least rhetorically.
At least rhetorically. And, there's always political difficulties once people get into office, so I don't think it's reasonable to expect that every single promise is going to be made. But you need to at least show initiative on most of the big ones. Now, Valérie Plante has shown a decent amount of initiative in social housing. But as you said, it makes up the smallest fraction of the budget, grouped in with others.
Yeah,
So
the second to last. The smallest one is corporate charges. Don't ask me what that means, but so social, yeah, it's 2.9% on social housing.
But I mean, like, Montreal, we've been screaming to the rooftops in Montreal to defund the police all summer. We had loads of protests in which, the police at the end of it fired tear gas into crowds.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ridiculous. And, to then not even to not do anything about it, but to actually increase the budget of the SPVM, it's kind of insulting almost.
It's the biggest
that
portion.
Is the statement right there.
Yeah, it's the largest portion of the entire budget. Like, how in 2020 or going into 2021, the largest portion of any city's budget should not be policing. Especially
during a time like this, with, like you were saying, with so many calls for defunding the police to then do the exact opposite. It's just, it can't be perceived as anything less than a slap in the face of those who have been crying for justice. And we're seeing similar issues here in Toronto. This past week, we were dealing with an issue where there was a 30-year-old transgender Black woman named Coco, who died under the custody of the Toronto Police Department after they were called for a mental health case. There was reports of a break-in. The cops, when they arrived, reported that there was no break-in, but took her into custody under the justification of mental health crisis. And then she later died under police custody, and it's being investigated right now by the SIU. And to make matters worse, the SIU repeatedly misgendered her in their reports and refused to correct when that was called out. So this is something that we're seeing across Canada, and it's just a failure to respond to the very important demands that people are making.
It's insane, and what you see across the board is time and time again, especially with the SPVM as well, and I'm pretty sure it has to go with virtually all police departments in major Canadian cities, where they just completely deny the existence of systemic discrimination. I mean, there have been like 2 or 3 in the last few years. Studies that have come out, inquiries into systemic racism within the SPVM, and time again they've come back and say, well, we disagree. It's insulting, it's ridiculous, and it's fucking, it's insane, and to bring them to bring them into the conversation on how to deal with these issues is just like inherently problematic. I mean, like, they were given a hell of a voice, the SPVM, when we were discussing whether or not we should have the police wear body cams, and they were all just like, oh no, actually, like, nobody wants this, we don't want it, our officers feel like they're under surveillance. Oh, boo fucking who. I mean, it's insane. Time and time again, we know what their response is going to be. We know how resistant they are going to be to this sort of change. And so, yes, they should have a voice. I mean, obviously, everybody involved, all parties involved should have a voice. But we give way too much credibility, way too much power to their voice within the conversation of trying to address these systemic inequalities.
And I think also what's hard to swallow is the consistent pairing by Valérie Plante of, like, we recognize systemic racism, that's why we're going to try and make things safer by policing, right? And they keep like bringing up like partnering with the SPVM and that sort of language as they talk about discrimination and racism and the systemic nature. Like, they acknowledge it. They say, like, and I quote, the city recognizes the systemic nature of racism and discrimination. And then further, to prevent this, we're going to collab with it's like, you can't collab with an inherently corrupt system. That's not how things work, right? You can't reform an inherently corrupt system. If something's inherently corrupt, you get rid of it. So this is all just like really, really staggering, because it's like, oh, that's nice. They recognize that systemic racism is real. And then their actions are just completely different with how to like deal with that.
It makes it almost worse, because so they're saying that they acknowledge it, but we're not going to do anything about it. So what are we supposed to take from that? And also, I mean, looking at this also from, I mean, conservatives will always talk about, fiscal responsibility, right? But we're seeing that this money that's being allocated towards the police department is not actually addressing the overall problem of crime. It's not reducing crime.
No.
And so by tackling a problem so late and treating it as a problem instead of a symptom, it's actually the least fiscally responsible way to approach this. And on the topic of systematic racism within, the war on drugs is something that we're still failing to address, and we know that the war on drugs is one of the largest examples of systemic racism within within crime in Canada. It targets overwhelmingly minority groups and has just been overwhelmingly shown to have been a complete failure. And we have plenty of evidence from countries like Portugal, who have decriminalized all drugs, from countries like Switzerland, which went towards a more rehabilitation program, mental health program on the topic of drugs. And we've seen the results that's had on society have been overwhelmingly positive. So it's always frustrating to hear fiscal conservatives argue about the responsible way to spend money when we're wasting so much money in something that isn't actually solving the problem.
And not just fiscal conservatives, but, just like centrist liberals too. And they're, they're almost worse because they actually, like you said, they pretend to actually care and acknowledge racism in policing. And then they actively disregard all of our concerns, all of the concerns and demands of anti-racist activists and anti-policing activists. They know it's a problem, and they go ahead and increase the police budget. They decrease their social housing budget. They decrease investments in programs which could actually alleviate poverty and thus alleviate crime. They would rather us be disempowered and more easily controllable than to empower us economically.
Yeah, for sure.
I will say
that's
that
liberalism for you.
Definitely. I will say, though, particularly in the Montreal context, although it was, it's still like the second smallest part of the of the budget, it was an increase in spending. That is true.
Which which is very depressing.
Yeah.
If anything.
Yeah, like they could be spending. I mean, they could be spending it on implementing, I forget the word, but like maybe implementing universal basic income for Montrealers as like a test for Canada. We could be the leaders in really being taking care of our citizens and taking care of each other and making our lives better. Like at the end of the day, I tend to get sometimes sentimental. It's just like people's lives should just be good. Like, we should just have nice, like safe, peaceful lives. And we could be really, if the governments wanted to, we could be the leaders in that. And they have the money, they have the resources, they have the demands from the citizens. So like, why are they even thinking about the police? Like, it's like, just put your focus elsewhere.
What they lack
And
is
also,
the political will.
Yeah.